G'day, Francis Leach here for Australian Unions. Well, it's an important time for workers around Australia because in a couple of weeks' time, the Albanese Labor government is holding its Jobs and Skills Summit. And part of that discussion has to be what is best for workers. In fact, that has to be at the centre of the discussion. So, ahead of that, Jim Stanford from the Centre for Future Work and the ACTU have written a fantastic new paper called An Economy That Works for People. And it's all about reimagining and redrawing the Australian economy to make sure that workers get a fair share of everything that this country and our economy has to offer. Jim Stanford joins us now. How are you, Jim?
I'm very well, Francis. Thanks for having me.
I loved reading your paper, and one of the things that you say in it that is really important as a fundamental baseline is that the economy doesn't just happen like the sun coming up and the moon rising as a force of nature. It's a series of choices we make about what our priorities are, and this paper talks about putting workers back at the centre of our economic plan.
It seems sensible, doesn't it, that human beings who get out of bed on Monday morning and go off and do a job and produce actual goods and services that we add up and call our GDP. It's human beings who make the economy work. And often that gets lost in some of the conventional discourse that tries to treat the economy as if it's separate from us, like it's some kind of machine or even some kind of animal, some kind of hungry animal out there that we have to feed with sacrifices of some kind in order to keep it well behaved. And that's nonsense. Especially, Francis, we were reminded of this during the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, when particularly the Omicron wave broke out in Australia, and hundreds of thousands of people had to call in sick, either because they had COVID or they'd been exposed to COVID or they were caring for someone with COVID. And all of a sudden, the economy was grinding to a halt. It's not because, we locked people down. It's because human beings couldn't go to work. And that, in a way, was a very dramatic reminder for us that human beings make the economy function. And if we want a strong economy, we have to take care of those human beings. We have to value them. We have to make sure that they're secure, well motivated, well compensated, and protected. And those are, I think, the core values that have to be reflected in any economic policy framework. We can't just get in there with the charts and graphs and the formulas and the goals, like budget balance and low inflation, et cetera. We have to remember it's human beings that ultimately matter for the economy.
And we have this economy at the moment which exposes the frailties and the lies of the neoliberal dream, as it were, isn't it? Because we've got supposedly low unemployment, but the truth is a lot of that low number is down to the fact that we have huge numbers of people in insecure work and not enough hours. We've got high inflation, but we have wages stagnant, so people are not keeping pace with the price of goods and services they've got to pay for, despite the fact they're working hard, and we've got no impetus for wage rises. So at the bottom level, workers in the current economic framework are the last priority.
You're absolutely right, Francis. And some of these challenges, of course, are related to the pandemic and what happened and how we came out of it. So, we gotta take that into account for sure. But many of these challenges have been brewing for years before. And the first part of our paper, frankly, sums up the evidence of Australia's underperformance over the last decade. That, of course, was the decade that a series of three coalition governments was in power. They were focused on enriching business and helping out their mates in particular industries. They were vilifying unions and trying to discipline workers and keep them insecure. So it's in a way, I'm not surprised that Peter Dutton doesn't want to come to the Jobs Summit, because of course the Jobs Summit is going to be addressing failures that are the legacy of his government that he was part of. So part of it is going to be to catalog and analyze and understand those failures. The failure of wage growth, for example. We had a decade with zero wage growth, and now real wages are falling because wages, as you mentioned, are falling way behind inflation. And lots of other problems. We've got an enormous imbalance between corporate profits and corporate investment. Corporate profits have never been higher as a share of GDP, and that's not an accident. That's because the government has been, until now, bending over backwards to enrich corporations and the investors who own them, while suppressing wages and making sure that workers don't get a decent share of the pie. But what are corporations doing with that money? They are not investing it. In fact, investment as a share of GDP has never been weaker in our entire post-war history. Of the hundreds of billions of dollars that corporations earned in profits this year, only 37 cents on the dollar was actually reinvested in new capital, equipment, technology, and so on. And this is just an enormous, it's like money going down the drain in our economy. The money goes to the corporations, but they don't pump it back into the economy. Those are some of the failures that we have to take account of, on top of the particular stresses and challenges associated with the pandemic.
Well, I mean, the paper points this out, doesn't it? I mean, I've looked at the figures that you provide there. Gross corporate profits grew by 83% over the last 6 years, 3 times as fast as aggregate nominal wages. And it's extraordinary that share of whatever wealth is being generated is just being hoovered up in profits that, as you said, aren't being reinvested. This can't continue because the economy won't sustain it, and people are really struggling. I mean, the social dislocation and all the problems that are associated with people being underpaid and not being able to pay their way will have its own impact on the economy, won't they, Jim?
You know, Francis, this explosion in corporate profits that you're mentioning has many impacts and many reasons to be concerned about it. One is just simple fairness. I mean, why should these powerful institutions and the rich people who are their biggest owners take so much of our wealth? So there's an automatic moral concern with what's going on. But there's some other economic fallout from it. One of them is around the issue of productivity and productivity growth. And I'm sure we're going to hear a lot about productivity at the Jobs Summit. Australian workers are working more productively than ever. Productivity has never been higher. The average Australian worker produces $110 of real GDP with each hour of work. And I can assure you they're not getting paid $110 for that hour. And yet, even though productivity has grown, wages have not grown. That is the ultimate source of that boom in corporate profits. And without the increase in wages to sort of match and validate the improvements in productivity, then productivity growth loses its value as a priority for economic progress. So that's one additional economic concern. Another additional economic concern related to the explosion of corporate profits is inflation. We hear all the time about the risk of a so-called wage price spiral and the risk that if workers get a wage increase, that will cause inflation. Why have we got the highest inflation in decades, even though wages went nowhere? It clearly is not caused by wages and by the labor market and by workers asking for too much. It is being caused by profits. So we, in this paper, we actually show, we calculate a new measure called unit profit cost, which is how much profit is baked into each dollar of additional GDP that the economy produces. And we often hear about unit labor cost because the coalition leaders, the Reserve Bank, conventional economists are obsessed that workers are going to get a wage increase. We always hear about unit labor cost. We never hear about unit profit cost. Unit profit cost is up 63% in just the last 6 years compared to unit labor costs, which have actually declined in real terms and are well below the RBA's inflation target in nominal terms. So it's not just moral outrage at stake here with the run-up in corporate profits. It's also fundamentally damaging Australia's economic potential.
Well, Jim, let's talk about some of the reforms that are proposed in your paper, An Economy That Works for People, starting with the Reserve Bank. Now, the Reserve Bank has been getting a caning, and rightly so in recent times, for its projections when it comes to inflation, which have been wildly off the mark, and then flip-flopping on the issue as to whether workers should get a pay rise, initially supporting pay rises relative to productivity as a way of keeping the economy ticking on, and then reversing on that at the same time getting their projections wrong.
It points to a bigger challenge, not just, a question of who's in charge of the Reserve Bank or anything like that. It's more, I think, the kind of the structural power and authority that we've given the Reserve Bank. In theory, they're supposed to be concerned with one thing and one thing alone, and that is targeting the rate of inflation and keeping it around 2.5%, which frankly is a number that was pulled out of the air. There's no particular rationale for 2.5%, but that's what they've been aiming for. Now, for 6 straight years, they missed that target from below. So for 6 straight years, we had inflation below the 2.5% target. Now, it's not a ceiling. It's supposed to be a target. And you should be concerned if inflation is too low, just like you're concerned if it's too high. And the reason it was too low is because wage growth was so weak. There's no doubt about that. So the RBA failed to meet its target. And at least they recognized, Dr. Philip Lowe, the governor, said several times, the problem here is wages aren't growing. We can't hit the 2.5% target when wages are so flat. And he highlighted the perversity of things like government pay caps on civil servants, public servants, for example, and other things that have kept wages down. Now, all of a sudden, after 6 years of missing the target from below, now inflation is above the target, and now the Reserve Bank is jacking up the interest rate, saying we're going to get it back to 2.5% no matter what. And they use those words, no matter what. That should send a chill down the back of anyone who works for a living in Australia, because it means they're willing and prepared to throw Australia into a recession if that's what it takes. And it is probably what it will take to get inflation back down to 2.5%. So after a decade of absolutely zero wage growth in real terms, suddenly now the Reserve Bank is also saying you have to take a big wage cut. In real terms, workers have already taken a 3% cut, and they're telling us to get ready to take it more. And that's just what we have to do. They don't talk about profits. They don't talk about the supermarket chains or the energy companies or anyone else who's soaking Australian consumers in this current inflation. Instead, they're just pointing the finger at workers. And this is why we need to have a different framework for the RBA. We have to give it a different set of instructions. It's not just inflation they should be concerned with. They should be looking at those other variables as well. And we have to have them work in concert with other governmental and regulatory agencies, so that it's not just a question of jacking up interest rates and throwing the whole economy into a recession. That's a cure that would be worse than the disease, frankly. So we need to have, I think, a more nuanced and flexible and multidimensional approach to managing inflation, always with a focus on full employment as the ultimate goal. Because as we said at the outset, it's people working and producing that make the economy function, and that has to be kept front and center.
And part of that is, as you say, a fair inflation reduction strategy that isn't just about disenfranchising workers and using unemployment to dampen demand in order to bring prices down, which is just devastating for working families who are already doing it really hard. You also talk in the paper about regulating labour markets so that real wages rise in tandem with labour productivity. Can you explain to people what that actually means?
I mean, the whole idea of the conventional approach to managing inflation that the RBA has followed is that they want to keep a certain amount of unemployment in the labor market. And I know that it sounds perverse to think that a government agency is actually trying to keep unemployment here. We should be trying to get rid of unemployment, but they preferred to have a certain level that they thought was the best at keeping wage growth in line. And that theory has not worked very well. So first of all, for many years, we had way too high unemployment and underemployment. We lost the potential income gains that we could have had if we'd put people to work. And now we have a situation where they actually want to jack up unemployment to try and get inflation back under control. There's better ways to try and do that, where you could combine very high levels of employment, near full employment, with stable rates of inflation. But it means that you have to have a different approach to managing wage growth over time. And instead of assuming that it's just going to be, a dog-eat-dog battle to the death between employers and unions over wages, and it's a battle that employers more often than not have been winning. What we do instead is we put in place institutional supports and structures and practices, things like collective bargaining, things like stronger national minimum wage, things like an awards system that is no longer just a safety net, but is actually seen as a way of progressing wages and conditions over time. You could sit down and negotiate those processes in a sensible, sustainable way. That way workers get a decent wage increase every year. Even if times are bad, they're still going to get a decent wage increase. And that's actually helpful because that puts money in workers' pockets. They spend it, and that helps make the economy stronger. Similarly, if the economy is strong and the unemployment rate is very low, well, you're still going to get a decent wage increase. You're not going to shoot for the moon just because you've got some bargaining power. You're going to get a wage increase that reflects productivity growth and inflation over time. So this is a more rational, in a way, cooperative way to regulate wage growth over time, so that Australians can share in the prosperity they produce, but in a way that's stable and sustainable in terms of the other macroeconomic goals that we have.
You also talk in this paper about taxation and how it can also play a part in making a fairer economy work and putting workers at the centre of our economic plan. What measures do you see within the realm of taxation that are important to be undertaken here?
Well, the reason we started talking about taxes in this paper, Francis, is to address this, I think, myth that's out there that the reason we've got inflation at 6.1% right now is because Australians have too much spending power. They got too much money to spend. And, that's going to come as a surprise to most working families who can hardly cover the bills, right? But there is this idea that aggregate demand, as they call it in economics, is too strong, and we have to reduce aggregate demand in order to bring prices back down. Now, I don't buy that as the main explanation for the inflation that we're experiencing. It's more due to the unique conditions of the pandemic, things like the supply chains that were disrupted, the war in Ukraine and the shock to energy prices that we've experienced, and some of the readjustments after the lockdowns of the pandemic. So I don't think that the core problem is too much spending power. If it is, to the extent that we want to restrain spending power, then you shouldn't go after average workers who didn't cause the problem. You should go after the segments of society that can best afford to pay a little bit more and to consume a little bit less. And I would start with the corporations who've made out like bandits in the current inflation. Think of the energy companies, the supermarket chains, and others who've got record profits. Those record profits are the flip side of the coin of the higher prices that we pay for everything we buy. We should also look at high-income households. Frankly, they don't need to borrow to go out and finance their spending, right? They don't borrow to buy a yacht. They buy a yacht because they're rich. So they aren't going to be affected by higher interest rates. It's a very unfair way to try and reduce purchasing power and bring down inflation. So having fairer taxes for high income households, and particularly on the corporations who've made such record profits, is just a better way of trying to control the level of purchasing power in the economy and help to bring down inflation in that regard.
Jim, it's been great talking to you. The paper, An Economy for Working People, people can find via the Australian Union's website, australianunions.org.au, or they can search the Australian Institute and the Centre for Future Work, and they will find it there as well. And it's going to be a lively and important discussion at the Jobs and Skills Summit in early September, and you've made an enormous contribution to making sure that workers are at the centre of the discussion. Thank you for being with us on Australian Union's YouTube today.
Thank you very much, Francis, for your show and for having me on it.
Dr. Jim Stanford there from the Centre for Future Work. He is the author of the paper, which is called An Economy That Works for People, and he talking to us there about why workers and the plight of workers should be at the centre of our economic plan, which is always the case at Australian Unions. That's why you should go to australianunions.org.au and find out how you become a union member. That's it from us for today. We'll catch you very soon. Bye-bye.